Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video about the options to make sure that while you're sat waiting for something like a GPS lock on your quad or plane or wing, that your avatar or DJI airside unit doesn't overheat. Now, I use a couple of different methods, and I need to say thank you to this chap here. This was the message I got from Robin. Robin was asking about how do I do it, because there's lots of discussion on the forums. And the answer is I actually do it in lots of different ways. Now, of course, this is really only an issue if you're going to power the model and it's going to be sat there for several minutes without any airflow with the VTX in kind of standby mode, because the video transmitter in the model is going to get hot if there isn't enough airflow and it can't dissipate the heat. Now, in winter, you'll probably find that that's less of an issue, but in the summer where there isn't a breath of wind, then you know what? You as a pilot will overheat stood in the sunshine, never mind your video transmitter. So there are a couple of basic things that I would recommend to make sure that this doesn't happen. First and foremost is make sure that when you're powering the system that the VTX or the avatar unit is in good airflow, that there is some kind of breeze. If there is a breeze, make sure it's getting the benefit of it. So for example, if it's hidden away inside a model, then make sure that you remove the battery hatch just to let that heat get out. I've also added heat sinks to some of the smaller units. The larger units tend to be good once you're flying, but things like the 1S units from people like Walksnail, I tend to add a little heat sink on there as well. Things like this AR Wing Baby Pro that I did in my iNav for Beginners series shows how I do that. It just gives an extra bit of mass to soak up some of that heat while you're getting ready to fly. But the big tip is if you are going to be waiting for a GPS to lock, then avoid the problem in the first place. If you can get the GPS to lock off a battery or via the USB, then do that before you fly. And that's because GPSs have a cold, warm and hot lock. A cold lock can take several minutes. That's usually what you're waiting for the first time you fly. However, once you've flown once, you'll find that the subsequent times that use the GPS, it will lock in seconds as it just reacquires the satellites, confirms the constellation is still more or less what it saw last time, and then goes, okay, I'm good to go. So if you can get that cold lock stuff done, and that can, with modern flight controllers, be done by plugging in some kind of USB power bank into the flight controller, or I've got a little adapter I'll show you at the end of the video that I use to kind of get the GPS to lock before I fly for the day, then that kind of avoids the whole problem. So let's talk about the three different ways that I approach this. First and foremost is I just get some kind of separatable power connection from the battery system or the flight controller's regulated 9 or 10 volts into the avatar or the DJI Air unit. So for example, here's one inside the build that I've just redone. I tend to use JST flying leads. They're easily enough to carry the kind of current, about 1.5 amps-ish, depending on the power levels you're using. And I have that unplugged, and then when the GPS has a lock, I will plug that in. Obviously, with systems like the DJI stuff, you have to be a little bit more careful, because if you're using the DJI controller, you don't have any input, S-bus input going into the flight controller until you've powered that up. But for things like the avatar units, I do it fairly regularly, and it also makes removing the avatar units and swapping things around an awful lot easier if you have a standard set of connections that's in every plane and model that you build. I also like the side connectors on the latest versions of the avatar units. I don't tend to use the soldered connections, and that's because I can actually unplug the connector at the side here. So I can unplug that while the GPS is getting a lock. Once I get the confirmation tones from iNav, typically on a model like this, that the GPS is locked and happy, then I can just push that home, and then the avatar unit will burst into life, confirm on my goggles everything is working, my OSD is okay, and then I can go and fly. Now, this does, of course, require some manual dexterity and does require an extra step in terms of putting it all together, but it's reasonably foolproof, so long as you remember to unplug that power connector before you plug the battery in for the first time. Second way to do it is to add something like a Menace RC switch. Now this allows you to, by use of a PWM signal, turn the unit on and off. And I've done a video recently where I added one into a radio control card to control the lights, but they can be used for anything, including powering your video transmitter. And that means they're not always great for quads because they're not very small. And also you need that PWM signal. However, lots of modern flight controllers will allow you to reuse your LED pad on the flight controller as a PWM signal. but it does provide a cute way in planes where you have lots of spare PWM outputs to add that functionality in. It's something that I don't do here. I tend to like that physical connection that I've just talked about in step 1, as it means it always works and I know exactly where I'm up to. The only thing to think about with this second option is to make sure that the fail-safe settings on the flight controller for those PWM outputs that you're using to turn that switch on and off act in the right way if you have a fail-safe. You don't want your video transmitter turning off. If there's a fail-safe incident, you kind of want to watch exactly what's going on. So be cautious of that and make sure that in the event of a fail-safe, that goes high and turns the switch on so the video transmitter remains on and you can still see what the heck's going on. Finally, the third way is the way that I think we're going to be moving to over the next couple of years. It's becoming more and more common to not only add some kind of specialized output, either 9 or 10 volts typically, that's all smooth and regulated to run your HD FPV video transmitter, but also to have that to be able to turn on and off at the flick of a switch on the radio. There are lots of different flight controllers that offer this kind of functionality now. Things like the Matek F405 Mini TE, the Flywheel F722 Pro, etc. These all have that kind of functionality, and I think it's going to become more of a standard thing as we go through the next 18 months. So those are the 3 ways that I would look to do it. Invariably, I end up using the first one because I have that standard configuration in pretty much all my planes and wings. It allows me to swap units out pretty easily because I have the JST power connection and have a servo style lead that connects the transmit and receive pins for my on-screen display. The big tip, of course, is that if you can get your GPS locked before you start flying, then the GPS lock is going to take just a matter of seconds, and that's not going to be any issue even for a VTX in bright sunshine. While we're talking about that, I did mention I'd show you one last little tip. I made this little unit that sits in my battery box, which is one of those little Matek 5-volt adapters, and this is designed to plug into the ground and positive pins on a GPS, so I can unplug the GPS from a flight controller, plug this into it and power it, and it can sit there for 3 or 4 minutes and get the GPS lock, and I can plug it back into the flight controller, and then when I start the system properly, it's going to burst into life. That's just there for those instances where I do have an issue with trying to get to the power and disconnect it for the Avatar or VTX unit. And it's one of those things that gets used very rarely because, to be honest, the power tends to be disconnected from the VTX anyway in the model. So when the GPS locks up and iNav tells me that it's ready to fly, I'll just go and make that JST connection and I'm ready to chuck the model. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Pedantry 360 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.